Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am honestly really glad you're here with us today.
It's great to be here.
We have a massive topic, and to be completely honest with you, when I first saw the reading list, I was a little skeptical.
Oh, I can imagine.
We're doing a deep dive into some source material that makes a, well, a pretty wild claim.
I think that's fair to say, and I can guess why you were skeptical. When people hear the name of the figure we're discussing today, they usually have a very specific and often, let's say, negative reaction.
Oh, absolutely. The name is John Calvin. And for most people, even a lot of people in the church, that name just conjures up this image of a super stern, unsmiling guy in a black robe.
The fun police.
Exactly. The fun police.
Right.
The guy who just wants to talk about predestination and tell you everything you enjoy is wrong. You know, the frozen chosen.
That is the caricature, for sure. It's a persistent one.
Right. But the material we're looking at today, specifically David W. Hall's analysis of 10 ways modern culture is different because of John Calvin, argues that this caricature is just missing the forest for the trees. The whole argument here is that Calvin wasn't just a theologian sitting in an ivory tower. He was an architect, an unexpected architect of, well, the modern world.
That's the premise. And Hall, the author we're looking at, he doesn't pull any punches with it. He starts right off the bat by comparing Calvin to some of the biggest heavyweights in modern history.
I saw that. It's a bold move.
It is. He argues that if you look at the cumulative impact on the world, I mean, how we live, how we vote, how we work, even how we think about money, Calvin's footprint is arguably larger than someone like Rousseau or Nietzsche or even Karl Marx.
Okay, stop there for a second. That is the claim that stopped me in my tracks.
I thought it might.
Karl Marx. I mean, Marx literally redrew the geopolitical map of the 20th century. You had half the world living under systems that claimed his name. Nietzsche, I mean, he redefined modern philosophy. And you're saying a French pastor from the 1500s punches in that same weight class.
I am. And actually, I think Hall is arguing he punches above that weight class.
How so?
Well, because his influence is more enduring and, frankly, more constructive. Think about Marx. His ideas led to revolutions, yes, but they also led to totalitarianism, economic collapse, gulags, tens of millions dead.
A dark legacy, to say the least.
A very dark legacy. Calvin's ideas, as we're going to see, laid the groundwork for the free institutions, the economic systems, and the civil liberties that we, especially in the West, just take for granted today.
So if I'm hearing you right, the argument is that we're all, in a sense, living in a house that John Calvin built, even if we've never read a word he wrote, even if we actively disagree with his theology.
That is a perfect way to put it. We're swimming in water that he treated. Whether it's the fact that you can vote for your leaders, or that you expect your children to get an education.
Or even just the idea that your job has dignity.
Yes, or the way you think about your bank account and interest rates. All of that has a surprisingly direct line back to this one city, Geneva, in the mid-16th century.
Well, that is a big check to write. So today we're going to try to cash it. We're going to walk through the evidence that Hall presents. But before we get to all the cultural stuff, the schools, the politics, the money, we have to talk about the man himself.
We do. Context is everything.
Because I think my mental image of him is just a brain in a jar, you know? Did he have a life? Was he a real person?
He had a very, very intense life. And it didn't start in a pulpit, which I think is key. He was born in 1509 in Noyon, France.
Yeah.
And here's a detail from the source that explains a lot of what comes later. He was trained as a lawyer.
Ah, okay. That clicks. When you read the Institutes, it's so structured, so logical, it reads like a legal brief sometimes.
Exactly. He had a brilliant legal mind. He studied humanism. He was on track to be a top-tier scholar or lawyer, studying at some of the best universities in France. But then, somewhere around 1533 or 34, something big happened. He calls it a sudden conversion.
What does that mean, a sudden conversion? Was it a Damascus Road moment?
He's a bit private about the details, but he describes his heart as being very hard, very attached to the traditions of the Roman Church. And then he says, God subdued and brought my halt to teachableness. He essentially realized that the Protestant movement, which was, a very dangerous thing to be part of in France at the time, was correct about the final authority of Scripture.
And when you say dangerous, we're not talking about getting unfriended on social media. We're not talking about getting a mean email.
No. We're talking about getting arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake.
Right.
The King of France, Francis I, was cracking down hard. There was an event called the Affair of the Placards, where Protestant posters were put up all over Paris, even on the king's bedroom door.
That's bold.
It was. And the king's reaction was brutal. Calvin was associated with the movement's leaders, and he had to flee Paris. There's a famous story that he escaped by climbing out of a window on a rope made of bed sheets, remarkably similar to the Apostle Paul in Damascus.
So from a promising academic career to a fugitive overnight.
He's a refugee. He's a wanted man. He spends the next couple of years on the run, using fake names, moving from city to city. He eventually leaves France entirely and heads for Strasbourg, a free imperial city. His goal was just to be a scholar. He wanted a quiet life in a library, writing books.
That is relatable. I think a lot of us would prefer that.
But on his way to Strasbourg, a war broke out between Francis I and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The main road was blocked by troops, forcing him to take a long detour south. And that detour took him through a small French-speaking city called Geneva.
The famous detour. And this is where he runs into William Farel, right?
Yes. Farel was this fiery, red-bearded, incredibly passionate reformer who was already in Geneva. He'd managed to get the city to vote to become Protestant, but it was just total chaos.
So the city was officially Protestant, but they didn't really know what that meant in practice.
Not at all. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Farel hears that the young author of this brilliant new book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which Calvin had just published in his first edition, is in town for one night, just passing through.
So he sees his chance.
He goes straight to Calvin's inn, bangs on the door, and basically demands that he stay and help bring order to the Genevan church.
And Calvin, wanting the quiet life, says no.
Calvin says, no, thank you. I'm a scholar. I'm shy. I'm not a pastor. I don't want to get involved in city administration and politics. He just wants to study.
Yeah.
And Farel gets angry.
What does he do?
He stands up, this huge, intimidating figure, and he points his finger at Calvin and literally calls down a curse from God. He says, may God curse your studies and your quiet life if you refuse to aid his church in her time of need.
Wow. That is intense. Nice books you have there. Be a shame if God cursed them.
It terrified Calvin. He wrote later that he felt like God had reached down from heaven and laid his powerful hand on him. He felt he had no choice, so he stayed. That was 1536.
But it didn't go well, did it? I remember reading that he got kicked out.
It was a complete disaster. You have to understand, Geneva at this time was a rough town. It wasn't some pious, quiet village. It was known for gambling, public drunkenness, riots, and just general disorder.
Not exactly a model city.
Far from it.
Yeah.
And Calvin and Farel come in and try to bring moral discipline. They wanted the church to have the authority to excommunicate people for unrepentant sin. The city council, who were used to running everything, were not having it.
They saw it as a power grab.
They did. The tension built and built, and in 1538, just 2 years after he arrived, the council held a vote, and they exiled both Calvin and Farel, ordered them to leave the city within 3 days.
So the man we're calling the architect of the modern world was fired from his first major job and humiliated.
Fired and humiliated. He went to Strasbourg, which is where he wanted to go in the first place. And honestly, the source material suggests those next 3 years were the happiest of his life.
Oh,
Yeah. He pastored a church of French refugees, people who actually wanted to be there. He got married to a wonderful widow named Idelette de Bure. He revised the institutes. He was finally living the life he wanted. He thought he was done with Geneva forever.
But Geneva wasn't done with him.
Not at all. As soon as he left, the city fell back into chaos. There were political factions fighting. The Catholic Church, led by a very clever cardinal named Sadoleto, tried to lure the city back to Rome.
So they were vulnerable.
Very. And finally, the city council realized they'd made a huge mistake. They needed the one man who had the intellectual firepower and the organizational skill to lead them. In 1541, they swallowed their pride, wrote to him in Strasbourg, and begged him to return.
That must have been a tough decision. I mean, going back to the place that publicly shamed you and kicked you out.
He did not want to go. He wrote to a friend, I would rather die 100 times than to that cross on which one had to perish daily 1,000 times over. He called Geneva a crass, a place of torture.
And yet he went back.
He felt it was his duty to God. He felt he couldn't say no, so he went back.
And that return in 1541 is really the starting gun for the legacy we are discussing today, right?
That's it. He stays there from 1541 until his death in 1564. And in those 23 years, he basically rebuilds the city from the ground up, culturally, religiously, and institutionally. And that's where Hall's list of 10 ways really comes from. It's the fruit of that second Genevan ministry.
Okay, so let's get into that list. The outline for today groups these impacts into some really helpful categories: the mind, the hands, the heart, and the state. Let's start with the mind. Education.
This is impact area 1 in the source, and for good reason. I think if you don't understand the shift in education that happened in Geneva, You miss the engine for everything else.
So paint the picture for us. What was the situation before Calvin? What did education look like in, say, 1500?
Well, in the medieval era, education was basically a luxury good. It was for the aristocracy, for the sons of nobles, or it was for the clergy. If you were a peasant, a farmer, a blacksmith, a merchant, you didn't need to read
Why not?
because your life didn't require it. And more to the point, your spiritual life didn't require it. You went to Mass, you looked at the stained glass windows, which were called the Bible of the Poor, you listened to the priest chant in Latin, which you didn't understand anyway, and you went home.
So ignorance was the default setting for, what, 99% of the population?
That's a good way to put it. But the Reformation changes the fundamental logic of life. The Reformers, and Calvin especially, argued for sola scriptura. The Bible alone is the final, infallible rule of faith and practice.
Right, scripture alone.
Well, think about the implication of that. If the Bible is how God speaks to you directly, and you are personally responsible for your own soul before God, then you have to be able to read the Bible.
Literacy stops being a luxury and becomes a spiritual survival skill.
Exactly. You cannot be a mature Christian in this new way of thinking if you can't access the Word of God for yourself. You can't check if the priest is telling you the truth. You can't meditate on it. You can't teach it to your children.
So it wasn't just about getting smart. It was about getting saved, or at least understanding your salvation.
Precisely. So in 1559, after years of planning and fundraising, Calvin leads the charge to found the Geneva Academy. And this was not just some little Sunday school or a Bible study group. It was a serious, rigorous educational institution.
And it had 2 levels, right?
Yes. The source details this. First, there was the Scala Privata, which was essentially a grammar school, elementary, and high school for the youth of Geneva. Then there was Scala Publica, which was a seminary or university-level institution, primarily for training ministers who would then go out all over Europe.
The numbers here on the source are just wild to me. The public school, the Scala Privata, started with 280 students. By the time Calvin died just 5 years later, in 1564, there were 1,200 students in that part of the school.
And another 300 in the seminary.
In a city the size of Geneva, that is a huge percentage of the population. That's a city completely reorienting itself around education.
It's massive. But the most revolutionary part wasn't the size, it was the cost.
What was the cost?
It was tuition-free.
Wait, tuition-free? In the 1500s? How on earth did they pay for that?
Calvin argued relentlessly that the city should pay for it. He saw it as a public good. An educated populace was a benefit to the whole society, religiously, economically, and civically. So it was funded by the city government, along with private donations.
Hall calls this the forerunner to modern public education.
It really is. The idea that every child, not just the rich ones, not just the boys destined for the priesthood, should have their mind developed because they are an image bearer of God, that is a total paradigm shift.
It democratizes knowledge.
It breaks the monopoly on information that the clergy had held for 1,000 years. When you teach a cobbler's son to read Greek, you are giving him the tools to question a priest or a magistrate or even a king. You are empowering the individual in a way that was unthinkable before.
And what were they learning? Was it just the Bible?
No, not at all. That's a common misconception. The Academy taught the Bible, of course, but it was a full classical humanist education. They taught Latin, Greek, Hebrew, logic, rhetoric, history. Calvin wanted to produce well-rounded thinking Christians.
So he's building this army of thinkers. But if you have all these new readers, you need to give them something to read, which leads us perfectly into the next impact area the source discusses: publishing.
The 16th century information revolution.
This is one of my favorite parts of the story. We talk about Silicon Valley today as this hub of innovation. The source argues that Geneva was the Silicon Valley of the 16th century, but for paper and ink.
It really was. The Stats Hall sites are incredible. In 1536, the year Calvin first arrived, Geneva published a grand total of 3 books. 3.
That's it for the whole year?
That's it. By 1561, they are churning out 48 different volumes a year. And by 1563, there are 34 printing presses running in the city, almost nonstop.
What were they printing?
Everything. Calvin's Institutes, his commentaries on almost every book of the Bible, sermons, theological treatises. But, and this is the crucial part, they were printing it all in the vernacular languages, mostly French.
Not Latin.
Not Latin. This was for the people. And we have to realize what they were doing with these books. They weren't just for the library in Geneva. They were for export, specifically for illegal export into Catholic France, where Protestantism was a capital crime.
This is where the story gets really spy novel. The source talks about these people called colporteurs. Now, when I first saw that word, I had no idea what it meant. What is a colporteur?
A colporteur was basically a traveling salesman, a peddler, someone who would walk from town to town with a big pack on his back, selling everyday goods, ribbons, needles, mirrors, little trinkets.
And something else.
And hidden in false bottoms in their packs or sewn into their coats were these small, cheaply printed banned books from Geneva.
So they were smugglers.
Spiritual smugglers. And the risk they took was absolute. The King of France issued something called the Edict de Chateaubriand in 1551. It was the ultimate ban hammer. It banned all books from Geneva. It banned anyone from printing them, selling them, or even just possessing them.
And the punishment was what? A fine?
The punishment was death.
Death.
Now,
just for having a book.
yes. And yet these colporteurs flooded France with this literature. The source mentions a man named Laurent de Normandie, who was a close friend of Calvin's. He was a former mayor of Noyon, Calvin's hometown, who became a refugee.
Yeah.
And he set up this entire underground distribution network.
It sounds like a drug cartel, but for theology.
Structurally, it's not a bad comparison. The demand was so high they couldn't print the books fast enough. People were starved for this teaching. And the printers in Geneva got incredibly clever to bypass the censors.
How so?
They'd use fake title pages. They would print a book of Calvin's theology, but put a cover on it that said something like Essays on Roman Law, printed in Venice. They would use French-style fonts to make it look like it came from Paris, not Geneva. They'd use fake publisher names. Anything to get the books past the border guards.
That is incredible. It's a testament to how powerful they believed these ideas were.
It shows that you cannot stop an idea whose time has come. Hall argues that this was the moment ideas truly transcended geography. Before this, if you wanted to learn from a master, you had to travel to his lecture hall in Bologna or Paris. Now, Calvin could sit in his study in Geneva and effectively teach a secret gathering of believers in a cellar in Lyon or Paris or all the way up in Scotland.
It's the internet. It's the 16th century blogosphere.
It is, and it created a shared culture, a shared identity. People in different countries under different kings were reading the same arguments, getting angry about the same abuses, and finding hope in the same gospel. And that kind of unity is very threatening to tyrants.
Okay, so that's the mind. We have a newly literate population and a mass media network to feed them ideas. Let's move to the next category, the hands. This is about work, money, and taking care of people. The source lists the doctrine of vocation as a major impact.
This is huge. And again, to really get it, we have to look at the medieval backdrop. In the medieval church, there was this very sharp, very high wall between the sacred and the secular.
Right. The sacred world was the world of priests, monks, nuns. The secular world was, well, everyone else.
Exactly. The thinking was if you really wanted to please God, if you wanted the highest form of Christian life, you left the world. You went into a monastery or a convent. You prayed all day. That was the religious life.
And being a farmer or a blacksmith?
That was necessary, sure. The world needs food and horseshoes, but it wasn't holy. It was just worldly. It was seen as a distraction from spiritual things.
It was second-class spiritual citizenship.
That's a great way to describe it. Calvin comes along and just smashes that wall to pieces. He argued that God is the creator of the physical world, not just the spiritual one. Therefore, engaging with the physical world, planting crops, building houses, drafting contracts, healing the sick, is a primary way of honoring the Creator.
So he didn't just elevate the secular jobs, he redefined them.
He erased the distinction. He taught that every lawful occupation is a calling or a vocation from God. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. Before the Reformation, only priests had a calling. Calvin said the nursing mother has a calling from God. The magistrate has a calling. The chimney sweep has a calling.
That must have been incredibly liberating for the average person. To be told, hey, you don't have to become a monk to matter to God. You can serve God by making really, really good shoes.
It changes everything about how you approach your work. If your daily work is an offering to God, you strive for excellence, you don't cut corners, you don't cheat your customers. This is the real root of the so-called Protestant work ethic. It's not about working yourself to death to get rich. It's about doing your work coram Deo before the face of God.
The source uses the composer J.S. Bach as an example here.
Bach is the perfect example.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Calvinist, he was a Lutheran, but he was swimming in this same Reformation worldview. He would sign his musical scores, even the secular ones, with SDG.
Soli Deo Gloria.
To God alone be the glory. He put that on his Brandenburg concertos just as much as his church cantatas. He didn't see a difference. Composing beautiful music glorified God because God is the one who invented melody and harmony.
I love that. Now let's pivot to the other side of economics, because if you have a bustling city with all this work going on, you also have people who fall through the cracks, the sick, the widowed, the refugees. How did Calvin's Geneva handle poverty?
This brings us to another one of Hall's points, the Bourse française. And you have to remember the context we talked about earlier. Geneva was basically a massive refugee camp.
Right, the population doubled.
It doubled in a very short time. You have thousands upon thousands of people flooding in, fleeing persecution in France, Italy, England. They arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs. You have widows whose husbands were martyred, orphans, men who had to abandon their businesses and farms.
That's a humanitarian crisis, a logistical nightmare. Where do they all sleep? What do they eat?
Exactly. The city infrastructure just couldn't handle it on its own. So Calvin revived and reorganized the church office of deacon, the diaconate.
But this wasn't a state-run welfare program, right? The source makes a clear distinction there.
A very clear distinction.
Yeah.
Calvin believed that caring for the poor was the specific duty of the church, managed by the deacons. They established the Bourse française, which was basically a deacon's fund specifically for the French refugees.
So it was a private charity, essentially.
Yes, but highly organized. This wasn't just standing on a corner handing out cash. The deacons would visit families, verify their needs, and provide aid. They'd visit the sick. They'd find housing for widows and orphans. But, and this is the key, the goal was never, ever permanent dependency.
The source mentions they gave out tools.
Yes. They didn't just give handouts, they gave handouts. The whole system was oriented around the doctrine of vocation we just discussed. If a master weaver arrived with nothing, the Boers might buy him a new loom so he could start his business again. If a tailor arrived, they'd get him scissors and cloth. If a farmer arrived, they'd help him find land to work.
So the goal was to restore the person's dignity by getting them back to their work, back to their calling.
Exactly. The aid was interim assistance. It was a bridge to get them back to self-sufficiency. It sounds like a very modern approach to social work, doesn't it? Needs assessment, temporary aid, job training, rehabilitation.
It does. And the source also says that moral accountability went along with the aid?
It did. The deacons would also provide spiritual counsel. They expected recipients to be living responsible lives. It was a holistic approach, body and soul. And it worked. It prevented Geneva from collapsing under the weight of the refugee crisis. In fact, it did the opposite. It turned a potential burden into an economic boom because all those skilled refugees eventually started businesses and contributed to the city's economy.
Speaking of the economy, we have to tackle the big money question. Impact Area 8, economics and profit. There's this long-standing debate about Calvinism and capitalism.
The Weber thesis.
Right. Max Weber wrote that famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, basically blaming Calvinists for modern capitalism because they supposedly thought being wealthy was a sign of God's favor, a sign that you were one of the elect.
And Hall, our source, is very quick to correct that.
Yep.
He points out that Weber's thesis has been largely debunked by serious historians. Calvin did not teach that having a full bank account meant you were saved. In fact, if you read his sermons, he's constantly warning against the spiritual dangers of riches and greed.
So where did Weber get it wrong?
He basically misunderstood the doctrine and then cherry-picked some quotes from later Puritans, generations after Calvin. Calvin's view was that property and profit are legitimate, but they come with heavy responsibilities.
How did he ground that?
He looked at the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. Calvin, with his legal mind, said that this command doesn't just forbid theft. It positively implies the right to hold and protect personal property. If it's wrong for me to steal from you, it must mean that the thing I'm not supposed to steal is rightfully yours.
That makes sense.
But he did change the rules on something that had a huge economic impact. Interest.
Usury.
Exactly. For centuries, the medieval church had banned usury, which they defined as charging any interest on a loan. They base this on Old Testament passages where God tells the Israelites not to charge interest to their poor brothers.
So if I lent you money, I could only ask for the principal back, nothing more.
Right. Which sounds nice and charitable, but in practice it freezes the economy. It means there's no incentive for anyone with capital to lend money for business ventures. If you want to start a printing press and you need capital, no one will lend it to you because there's no return for them, only risk.
So how did Calvin get around that Bible verse?
He looked at the context. He was one of the first to do this systematically. He argued that the Old Testament prohibition was about protecting the vulnerable. You shouldn't charge interest to a starving man who needs to borrow money to buy bread for his family. That's predatory. That's exploitation.
But a business loan is different.
But a commercial loan between two businessmen, he argued, is a completely different matter. If I, a wealthy merchant, lend you money to buy a new ship to transport goods and you make a huge profit from that voyage, why shouldn't I, the one who took the risk on the loan, share in a small pre-agreed part of that profit through interest?
So he distinguished between biting usury that exploits the poor and productive credit for business investment.
That's it. And that single distinction unlocked the modern economy. It allowed Geneva to become a banking center. It allowed for capital accumulation and large-scale investment. But Calvin was always the pastor. He insisted that interest rates be capped by the city. He was ruthless towards anyone who defrauded others or charged predatory rates.
He actually wrote a prayer for workers to say, didn't he?
He did. It asked God, "Grant that I may follow my calling without any fraud or deception." He wanted a free market, but a moral market, bounded by God's law.
Okay, let's move to the heart. Worship and music. This might seem like a niche topic just for church nerds, but the source argues that music in the vernacular had a massive society-shaping cultural impact.
It's hard for us to imagine today, but try to picture a standard medieval church service. You walk into a giant, beautiful, echoing cathedral, but the priest is way up at the front with his back to you, whispering in Latin. The choir, a group of professional, trained male singers, is up in a loft, singing incredibly complex polyphony, also in Latin.
And I'm standing there, a peasant who speaks French, understanding literally nothing of what is being said or sung.
You are a spectator. You are watching a performance. You might feel a sense of awe or mystery, but you are not participating. Calvin looked at that and said, "This is wrong." He believed the whole congregation should sing. And to do that, they had to sing in their own language.
Protestant karaoke?
In a way. But the content mattered immensely to him. He didn't want them singing just any sentimental hymns. He wanted them singing the Psalms, the actual words of the Bible, put to music.
This is the famous Genevan Psalter?
Yes, he wasn't a great poet or musician himself, so he hired the best he could find. Men like Clément Marot, the most famous poet in France at the time, and the musician Louis Bourgeois. Their job was to take the Hebrew Psalms, translate them into beautiful rhythmic French poetry, and set them to catchy, memorable, simple tunes that anyone could sing.
And it took off like wildfire.
The numbers are staggering. The source mentions that the complete 1562 edition, Beza's edition, printed 27,400 copies in its first year. That's bestseller territory, even today, let alone in the 16th century.
Why was it so popular?
Because it gave people a voice in worship for the first time. Yeah. And people were singing these psalms everywhere, in the marketplace, in their homes while they worked, in the fields, on ships. And psychologically, this does something profound. When you sing something over and over, you memorize it. It gets into your bones.
So the average person was memorizing huge chunks of scripture and theology without even trying.
Exactly. It was a mass media and memorization tool. It lodged deep theology into the popular mind. And it turned the congregation from a passive audience into an active, unified army.
Literally an army. There are stories of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, going into battle singing Psalm 68, "Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered."
Yes. Can you imagine hearing 1,000 soldiers marching towards you, singing that in unison? It's terrifying and incredibly unifying. It gave them a collective identity.
And the source mentions this tradition crossed the ocean, right? The Bay Psalm book in America.
Directly. The Puritans who settled Massachusetts were spiritual children of Geneva. The Bay Psalm book was the very first book printed in British North America in 1640. So the whole rhythm of American congregational worship, the idea that everyone participates, starts right there in Calvin's Geneva.
Okay, we have arrived at the final section, and honestly the one that feels the most complex and maybe the most consequential: the state, law, government, and liberty. If we're going to make the case that Calvin is an architect of the modern West, this is where the foundation is poured.
Absolutely. This is where the theology hits the political reality head-on. And we have to start where Calvin started, with his view of the law. This is Hall's Impact Area 3, the moral law.
The source mentions the third use of the law. Now, that sounds like a very technical theological term. Can you break that down for us?
I can try. The Reformers talked about God's law. Think of the Ten Commandments having different uses or functions. The first use is like a mirror. You look at the law, "You shall not lie," and the law reflects your own heart back at you, and you realize, oops, I lie. It shows you your sin. It shows you your need for a savior.
Got it. The law condemns me so that I run to Jesus for grace.
Exactly. The second use of the law is to restrain evil in society. We have laws against murder, not to make people holy, but just to keep society from descending into chaos. It's a civil use.
Yeah.
But Calvin put a huge emphasis on the third use. He said that for the Christian, for the person who is already saved by grace, the law is no longer a harsh judge. It becomes a friendly guide. It's like a map. It shows you how to live a life of gratitude that pleases the God who saved you. It's a pattern for thankful living.
So how does that affect politics?
Because Calvin argued that this moral law, this pattern for righteous living, applies to everyone, including and especially kings and rulers. The king is not the source of law, God is. The king is under the law just like the peasant. This is the seed of constitutionalism, of the rule of law, rather than the rule of men.
And that leads directly into the next point, impact area 4, freedom of the church.
This was the fight of Calvin's life in Geneva. In the medieval system, and even in some other Protestant cities like Zurich, the state basically ran the church. The city council would decide who could take communion, what the doctrine should be.
And Calvin said, no, stay in your lane.
He did. When he returned in 1541, he insisted that the city adopt what were called the ecclesiastical ordinances, and the key innovation was the establishment of the consistory.
What was the consistory? Was it a court?
It was sort of moral court, yes. It was a body made up of the pastors of the city and 12 elected elders from the congregation, not politicians. Their job was to handle the moral and spiritual discipline of the church.
What kind of things would they deal with?
All sorts of things. If you were beating your wife, or cheating your customers in business, or getting drunk and starting fights in the street, you can be summoned to appear before the consistory. They would rebuke you, counsel you, and in serious cases of unrepentance, they might bar you from the Lord's Supper.
That sounds incredibly intrusive to modern ears.
Oh, it was intrusive. There's no doubt about that. But here's the crucial political innovation. The city council hated it. They saw it as Calvin setting up a rival government. They wanted to control church discipline themselves.
So it was a power struggle.
A massive power struggle that lasted for over a decade. Calvin threatened to resign and leave multiple times to protect the consistory's independence. He was establishing a sphere sovereignty. The state has its sphere, the power of the sword for civil justice. But the church has its sphere, the power of the keys for spiritual discipline. Neither should control the other.
That is the beginning of the separation of church and state. Not to keep God out of government, but to keep the government out of the church.
You've got it.
Correct.
That is the key distinction.
Now let's talk about the structure of the government itself. Impact area 5, limited government.
This all flows from Calvin's view of human nature. This is the doctrine of total depravity. He didn't believe that people were as evil as they could possibly be, but he did believe that every part of a human being, our minds, our wills, our emotions, is tainted and corrupted by sin.
We're all broken. We all have a tendency toward selfishness and pride.
Exactly. We are all prone to selfishness and grabbing for power. So if you believe that, what kind of government do you build?
Well, you certainly don't give one single broken, sinful guy all the power.
Right. If you have a king with absolute power, and he is a sinner, it is almost inevitable that he will become a tyrant. Calvin preached a famous series of sermons on 1 Samuel 8, where God warns Israel what will happen if they demand a king. And Calvin just hammers on this point. Kings tend to be takers. They take your sons for war, they take your daughters for their court, they take your best fields and vineyards for themselves.
So what was his alternative to monarchy?
Republicanism, or what he called an aristocracy, or a system compounded of aristocracy and democracy, basically a system of checks and balances. He preferred a government where power was shared among many different people and councils.
Like in Geneva.
Exactly like Geneva. It had the Council of 200, the Little Council, the 4 syndics or mayors. To pass any significant law, you had to have multiple groups agree to it. He deliberately distributed the power so no one person or group could do too much damage.
He built a system designed for sinners, not for angels.
That's the core of it. He predated Montesquieu, the guy from the Enlightenment we usually credit for checks and balances, by 200 years.
And he liked elections, right? The source makes a point of that.
He did. He said, the most desirable kind of liberty is that we should not be compelled to obey every person who may be tyrannically put over our heads, but which allows of election, so that no one should rule except he be approved by us. He believed magistrates should be chosen by the votes of the people.
Okay, this brings us to what I think is the most radical point. The one that, to me, leads directly to 1776. Impact Area 6 calls it decentralized politics, but I want to talk about the idea of interposition.
This is the dynamite. This is the theological idea that changes history.
Explain it. Because for most of Christian history, the rule was basically the king is God's anointed, you must obey him. If you rebel against the king, you're rebelling against God.
Right. That was the standard interpretation of Romans 13. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. The standard Christian view for centuries was that if the king is a tyrant, you just have to suffer patiently and pray, because God put him there for some reason, maybe to test you.
And Calvin changed that.
He didn't throw it out, but he qualified it in a revolutionary way. He introduced the doctrine of the lesser magistrate.
The lesser magistrate.
He said, okay, a private citizen shouldn't just grab a pitchfork and a torch and go start a revolution. That's chaos. That's anarchy. But what about the other officials in the kingdom? The lower level officials, the elected representatives, the dukes, the mayors, the town councils.
They have authority from God, too.
Exactly. They've also been put in their place by God. Calvin argued that these lesser magistrates have a divine duty to protect the people from a greater magistrate, like a king if he becomes a lawless tyrant. If the king violates God's law and begins to crush the people's liberties, the lower officials must stand in the gap. They must interpose themselves between the tyrant and the people.
So it's not a rebellion of the mob. It's a lawful, orderly resistance led by other constituted authorities.
Yes. It frames resistance to tyranny not as a chaotic rebellion, but as a moral and legal duty. It's like the police captain arresting the police chief because the chief himself broke the law. It's an act of upholding the law against a lawless ruler.
And this is exactly what happened in the American Revolution, the Continental Congress.
Were the lesser magistrates. They were the duly elected representatives of the colonial assemblies. When King George III violated their established rights as Englishmen, they didn't just start a riot. They convened a Congress. They wrote legal petitions. And when that failed, they issued a formal declaration, a legal document, framing their revolution as a necessary act of interposition against a lawless king.
That is mind-blowing. So the internal logic of the Declaration of Independence is basically Calvinist political logic.
Many serious historians have called this the Calvinist theory of revolution, and the founders knew it. John Adams, who was a key founding father, explicitly credited this theological lineage for American independence. He knew exactly where these ideas came from.
So when we look at the source's conclusion, and it mentions the Massachusetts Body of Liberties or the influence on James Madison, it's not a stretch. It's not wishful thinking.
It is a direct historical line. The Puritans who settled New England were radical Calvinists. They came to America specifically to build a city on a hill based on these Genevan principles. They set up towns with public schools for everyone.
That's Calvin.
They set up town hall meetings with elected officials.
Calvin.
They set up a system of written laws based on the Bible that limited the power of their governors.
Calvin. The whole framework is there.
The whole framework, it's baked into the American political DNA.
And there is that quote in the source material from the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia that just sums this all up.
It's a powerful quote. Scalia, who was a Roman Catholic, by the way, not a Calvinist, said, "The principle that laws should be made by representatives of the people and not by kings or their ministers is the paramount political accomplishment of the millennium." And then he calls this principle specifically Calvinist republicanism.
The paramount political accomplishment of the millennium. And it comes from a theologian that most people just think of as a grumpy guy who talked about predestination.
It shows that ideas have consequences. Deep theological ideas have very practical, real-world consequences. Calvin's view of God as absolutely supreme, holy, and sovereign meant that no human king could ever claim absolute power for himself.
Only God is absolute.
Exactly. And his view of man as created in God's image and therefore valuable, but also as fallen and sinful, and therefore not to be trusted with absolute power, meant that we need both freedom and laws, liberty and limits, checks and balances.
We are getting to the end of our time, but I want to circle back to something the source said at the very end that really stuck with me. It was an observation from a scholar named Douglas Kelly. He says that Calvin's legacy is so strong precisely because its roots are often unperceived.
That is the sign of true, deep cultural success, isn't it? When an idea becomes so normal, so much a part of the air we breathe, that you don't even know it was ever a controversial idea. You just think, well, of course we should have elections, obviously.
Obviously, every kid should learn to read.
Obviously, the president isn't above the law. We don't call them Calvinist ideas anymore. We just call them common sense or modern life or the way things should be.
We are living in the structure he designed, even if we've completely forgotten the architect's name and painted over his blueprints.
That's a great image for it.
So here's the final thought for you, the listener. You might not be a Calvinist. You might not even be religious. You might find the theology of predestination confusing or, frankly, off-putting. But if you value your ability to go to a public library and read any book you want,
If you value the fact that your boss can't just seize your paycheck for no reason,
if you value the fact that the president is not a king, that he or she is bound by a constitution,
then you are, in some small way, interacting with and benefiting from the legacy of John Calvin.
that is a lot to chew on. I'm definitely going to look at the local library and the voting booth a little differently now.
It gives you a deeper appreciation for the roots of our liberty. It didn't just happen by accident. There were deep convictions underneath it.
Thank you so much for walking us through all this. This was a true deep dive.
My pleasure. It's an important story, and one that's not told often enough.
And thank you to everyone listening to Reformed Thinking. We hope this challenged you and maybe gave you some new categories for understanding the world around you. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and remember, ideas have consequences.